Alright, so now let's go ahead and cover the clipping brushes. These brushes are used a lot in the creation of mechanical details. It's important to kind of get a grasp of all of them to see exactly how they work. The one I use the most is Clip Curve right here. So if we go into Brush, you can just push B, C, C, and it'll select your clipping brush. Now you notice we press Control Shift and drag, and what it does is it pushes everything on the gradient, or on the side of the gradient, pushes all of those polygons towards the normal of the curve. So it just pushes everything straight down. Like we said previously, if you cut down here, so Control Shift drag, and just drag down there, you'll get a not exactly what you want clip. And the way you keep the clip curve so straight is you just keep Shift held, and it'll snap to angles. That's really useful for kind of like creating shoes and making them so they align directly to the ground. So hold Shift and click and drag, and it'll keep it straight. It works in every direction. So now we've basically just been using this clip curve for just one straight line. To curve it, like we said before, you go ahead and hold Control Shift, drag your line out, and then where you want the directional change to occur, you just go ahead and click Alt once and let go. And you can see it's starting to bend out, and it'll give us this nice curve that we can kind of move around with and clip it right there. And you can use these curves, you can use as many of these curves as you want to go around and create different changes in the surface. If you get too strenuous on the curve, if you make too many surface changes, you can see how last time the gradient changed sides. And when the gradient changes sides of the curve, it'll mess up. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that the gradient stays on one side of the curve. So you see here it's changing now, so we want to keep it around here. And it'll keep everything nice and clean. We'll make a nice clean cut. To make hard cuts, the way we do that is we go ahead and drag out our clip curve. And when you're at a point that you want a hard curve, or a hard surface change, you click Alt twice and cut down. Okay, so let's go ahead and go into the Clip Rectangle brush. Select the Clip Rectangle brush, and essentially what that does is conforms everything to your square. I'll go ahead and turn off symmetry. So you notice that my Clip Rectangle brush right now has two key functions enabled on it. If you go ahead and hold Control Shift and come up to your stroke palette, you'll see that we have two things enabled. We have square, which means that it'll always have equal sides, and center, which means it is drawn from the center of your initial click. So I'll leave center on and turn off square so you can kind of see what's going on there. So you can see it's drawn from the center, but now we can have different sizes of square, or of rectangle. And if we turn off center, it's just drawn from whichever angle you draw, and is pretty freehand at this point. I don't use this clipping brush too often, but it's important to know nonetheless, because it can save you some time. Alright, Clip Circle Center. This is one of the brushes I use quite often to create perfect circular meshes. It's really useful for not only just creating kind of circular boundaries to meshes, but also for cutting circles into meshes. So you press Alt to delete anywhere in the area. You can see it kind of shows that by having a darker area of the circle. So we can go ahead and clip out, and you can see it kind of gets rid of all the mesh in there, or rather it just pushes it in. Alright, so there's something important to note about this. It works perfectly as long as the little plus cursor you see in the center of the circle stays outside the mesh. The moment it moves inside the mesh, you can hold spacebar to move this around, by the way. So we can go, let's go ahead and hold the spacebar and move it in here. Hold Alt. And if I delete, you can see it kind of creates this little bolt area, which can be useful. I can see this being very useful. For example, creating kind of like a screw port or something. But most of the time this isn't what we want. So what we can go ahead and do is come back here and hold Alt. Again, we'll keep, so move it around with space. And we can go ahead and hold Alt to make sure it's subtractive, make it the size we want, and clip it out. Again, this is a little bit big, so you can see we're pushing this away from the area we want. I use too big of an area. So smaller areas work a lot better. And again, we can go ahead and go up here, move it around to kind of center it. And one way to make sure you're perfectly centered is to make the circle as big as the mesh you have and kind of move it around till you get to the center, and then just kind of go in from there. There we go. So that's about equal. All right, so that is clip circle center. And clip circle is exactly like clip rectangle. You essentially just drag a circle out, or any ellipse rather. It can be any shape. And it is not dragged out from the center. So this is a little bit less useful. I don't believe I use this at all, but it's important to note that it's there. All right, one other key function of the clipping brushes is here. Let's go ahead and select Clip Curve. And if I hold Control Shift and press space, you can see I get these two options. I have brush radius and I have polygroups. I'll go ahead and cover polygroups first. Polygroups, basically what it does is when you clip an area, I'll turn on polyframe so you can see what's going on. When you clip an area, all the areas or all the polygons that it affects, it merges into one polygroup. And this is extremely useful for a lot of the stuff we'll be using. So I'll have this on almost all the time. So what you can see is I have my new polygroup right here. What I can do is actually go ahead and delete all the other subdivision levels and then group loops. And I'll go ahead and polish that a bit. And so you can see it gives us this nice, just beveled edge right over here. So we can go ahead and go back here. And the more cuts you make, it always adds new polygroups. It doesn't add it to the same polygroups. You see these two polygroups are different polygroups. And this is pretty invaluable to creating hard surface stuff. So we can go ahead and lead higher and lower again and group loops again. You can see once you press group loops, it really kind of makes everything feel a lot better, like a lot more unified. And the other function of this well-hidden menu right here is brush radius. And essentially what this does, if we go ahead and select our clipping curve, is when we cut, it uses the brush's radius to determine how much it's going to cut and creates this kind of cool beveled effect. So if we create a smaller brush, go ahead and cut in, you can see it's much less actually. Cut, and then it kind of just pushes the rest of the mesh down towards the normal. So if we go ahead and go like that, you can see you can get some pretty cool effects like this, and it's pretty useful. I don't use it particularly in this character, but it is an extremely useful tool and can give you a lot of really cool details. So eventually if you make the brush large enough, it'll just completely ignore brush radius because the radius is too large. So you gotta really determine the brush radius size. And it just takes a lot of playing with to get exactly what you want. So you can get some pretty interesting looking effects by playing around with this. Okay, so the next thing we're going to cover in this kind of initial video is creating or using the traditional hard surface brushes to create different effects. And so I'll go over each of the brushes and kind of what they do to help us out. So one of the brushes I mainly use before I start refining stuff is the clay brush and the clay tubes brush. Clay tubes kind of gives you this really hard, very rough, square effect. Kind of raises the mesh. The clay brush itself is a little bit softer. It still raises the mesh, but it's more of a softer effect. And you can use either of these to start your mesh. I tend to use the clay tubes brush just because it's what I've grown accustomed to. But it's really a matter of preference. So what we can do is we can go ahead and kind of just move this mesh around a little bit. And create like a little torso, perhaps. Something really quick. Alright, so now what we can do is we can use the clay brush, or the clay tubes brush in my case, to kind of separate out the areas. Kind of create the different areas. So I'll just kind of build this up and kind of just add in just little strokes here and there. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just kind of, this is just the way you feel out the mesh and see exactly how you want it. Now, sometimes I'll go ahead and use the Damien standard brush, which we mentioned earlier, that you'll find in your light box in your brushes menu, right here. And what it does is it makes deep cuts within the mesh, so you can go ahead and separate out areas and kind of get cool effects. And this will kind of be really helpful for maybe determining where you want your plating to be and where you want different edges to be, different plates of the metal. So just kind of make something that almost resembles a human torso. And so, okay, so we have this really messy mesh. What do we do with it? There's two things we can do with it, or two things that I would recommend doing to it. One would be to use the trim dynamic brush right down here, or in the brush is just B, T, and D. And what that does is really gives you a varied stroke along the surface. You can see it does follow the surface, and it'll flatten it out and give it a really nice polished look, but it's a little bit rougher. You can see it makes more cuts and makes more errors. But that's good because it allows you to control it a little bit better than the H polish brush, which I'll show you next. So you can determine what you want with this brush by going over areas and kind of pushing them in, moving them around. You have more control with this brush. And then the next brush we would use would be the H polish brush. And you can just press BH to grab that brush. And what that does is it's pretty much like the trim dynamic brush. The harder you press, the more of a hard edge it'll give, and the softer you press, the more of a kind of rounding effect you'll get, or kind of a merging effect. So what we do is we can go ahead and just use the H polish brush, and you can see right away it gives you almost a very clean look. So we can go ahead and use the H polish brush and go around all this stuff and clean it up quite a bit. Another thing to note is that these brushes do work in the negative, and oddly enough, when working in the negative, they actually add to the mesh. They work positively. So if you hold Alt and you stroke, you can get these really nice raised effects on the mesh. Then you can always keep on going into the clay tubes brush and adding more stuff. It always helps to keep toying with the mesh and seeing what you can come up with. One more thing to note, when you make a unified skin, which I'll go ahead and do right now, go ahead and remesh all. And there's something peculiar about this. You can see how the mesh flow isn't really that great. Like here it's really good. We're getting a very continuous flow of edges. But right here, where there's a lot of 3-point intersections and 6-point intersections, you see right here, it'll smooth kind of weird. I'll turn off polyframe to show this. So if you hold shift and just smooth, hide our other mesh, hold shift and just smooth, you can see how you get these kind of rippling effects. It's very subtle. You can see right here and perhaps right here how it's kind of a little bit messed up. So there's a different smooth algorithm that you can use where you get these kind of poles. And the way you do it is if you hold Shift and then start brushing and then let go of Shift. And you can see you can clean these right up just with using the different algorithms. So it's okay to use unified skins and adaptive meshes. You can go ahead and smooth it out very easily just by using the new smooth algorithm by holding Shift, smoothing, and then letting go of Shift and keep smoothing. Leave your brush down. And you can see I just made I just projected all onto this new skin because right now we have a little bit of polygon tension over here, stretching this way a little bit. Either mesh is okay to use. Okay, so we kind of have the idea of how to use these brushes. Trim Dynamic gives you more control, but gives you a less polished result, but it makes it easier to cut into the mesh. I'd use H Polish after I use Trim Dynamic to kind of smooth out these areas that I did use. Damien Standard can be used to create kind of surface details and cuts in the mesh. And then one final thing that I'd like to cover with the traditional hard surface sculpting is stamps, stamp creation.